Hello,
Yeah.
I'm Tim Boatswain, and I'm a professor of anthropology. And I've been involved with my parents' stories about the war, about what happened. We're coming up to VE Day. And I thought it would be an interesting idea to talk to a German friend and colleague of mine about his experiences, although obviously not his personal experiences because he's in 2 generations down, but to talk about his perception as a German, as how he saw the war and how people reacted to the end of the war. So I'm now just going to pass over to my colleague. Over to you, Florian.
Yes, hello. My name is Florian Ruths. I'm German by birth, but I'm actually British as well, I may say. I've been in this country for 27 years now. I'm entering my 27th year, and I'm very grateful to this country because I'm actually trained here. I originally did my medical studies in Germany, and then I became a psychiatrist in this country. So this country has offered me a lot of generosity with regards to developing my career here, and I'm eternally grateful for being here. But for me, it is equally emotional to think about VE Day, which is a concept completely unknown in Germany. You know, the concept of VE Day, people would ask me, what does that actually mean? So I'm very delighted that we can have a bit of a discussion about that and, you know, exchange stories. Obviously, the story, I was born 20 years after the end of the war and 20 years after the VE Day. So I've got no personal experience, thankfully, but I have got some anecdotes that I'd like to share with you, and perhaps they're meaningful to people out there.
Thanks, Florian. Well, just to make sure we clarify, of course, VE Day meant victory in Europe, and it's celebrated on the 8th of May. Though technically, in fact, the war didn't come to an end because the Soviet Union didn't recognize the defeat in Europe until the 9th of May. But as far as the Western Allies were concerned, the 8th of May was the day to celebrate. And you may have seen, or at least your grandparents may have told you, that they as children saw celebrations in the streets and so on. Now, what I thought we'd try and do in this conversation is to talk about what it means to us now, 75 years on. Probably this will be the last major celebration because there are still some veterans who are alive who went through that. But in 25 years' time, clearly there won't be. Now, I've got some personal stories to tell, which we'll talk about, and I know Florian also has. But let's just put this in context. Europe had been ripped apart by the Second World War. The Germans, under the Nazi regime, had conquered a lot of Europe. And then 1941, things started to go wrong for Germany with the invasion of Russia, which didn't work out. And then slowly and gradually, the Allies came together. And of course, a very important point from the Allies' point of view was the joining of the war by America with its vast resources and the way it was able to help. So that's the context. And if you can imagine the war, every nation, whether it was the Germans or the British or the French, everybody went through huge amounts of deprivation, rationing, and difficulties. So for the ordinary people, it was a very severe and difficult time, which took years and years to recover. But obviously, it was a war of devastation too, with people being killed through intense amounts of bombing and fighting. So it was a terrible experience for our ancestors in that way. Now, I'm going to ask Florian for his view. First of all, how does the German nation deal with what was such a terrible past for them?
Well, this is a massive question that you're asking there. You know, and it's a really also interesting generational question because there's obviously generation divide. So, I mean, I could cut it really sort of in headlines. The generation that went through the war, sort of including my grandparents, they probably just sort of, they were probably, the bottom line was they were happy to be alive. A lot of people died. They were happy to be alive. And they said, you know, this was pretty bad. Let's just move on and rebuild the country. So between 1945 and 1955, people didn't really think too much about what had happened. They basically were busy kind of getting food together, building new houses, And Germany actually, as you may or may not know, recovered very quickly from the war. We call it the Wirtschaftswunder, which basically is the economy miracle. And within 10 years, Germany was back to where it was before the war, more or less. And, you know, Volkswagen was building lots of cars, and people were developing wealth, and people were immensely proud to have recovered from the war. And they would sort of say, oh, you know, well, and we won the World Cup in 1954. So that was the momentous moment where Germany thought we're back. And that went on for a while until the mid-60s when I was born. Sort of until about 65, 66, and then the rumblings came along with it. So people started saying, hang on, something happened there that wasn't entirely right. You know, the politicians that were in charge were basically sort of taken over from that period, and we're the same people, you know, not Nazis, obviously, but perhaps Christian Democrats that had been, you know, for example, Adenauer had been mayor of, I think, Cologne, you know, during the war, and so he was, you know, he was somehow linked to he was obviously alive during the Nazi time. So, and there were lots of former Nazis and perhaps also judges and all these kind of people actually being involved in democratic politics, you know, pretending nothing had happened. And so in the 60s, that changed with the student movement. So 1968, the hippie student movement say, you know, hang on guys, you parents, you were wrong. You've committed terrible crimes. And that's when Germany started actually processing all the sins of the war, and people really became aware this was terrible. And so there was a lot of memorizing and a lot of consensus within society to say, hey, we cannot allow this to happen again. This is terrible. We all need to know about this. We need to take responsibility. We need to make peace with our neighbors. We need to compensate Jewish people. We need to compensate victims of war. We really need to do what we can in order to own it and then process it, and never again. So that was the whole ethos in the 60s, 70s, and that's when I grew up. You know, in the war, we heard, it's a bit like in Britain, you hear about the victory of the war. In Germany, we heard about the terrible sins that were committed. So we grew up with a sense of guilt and a sense of shame. So that was very much ingrained in our nature. This is shameful. We're actually a shameful nation. Our forefathers were shameful. And then, you know, nowadays, you know, in the 80s, then there came a more of a recognition of owning that shame. Richard von Weizsäcker, he was the president at that time. He held a speech really for the first time as the head of state, owning German history and saying, we did wrong. And for us, the 8th of May, and that's Black VE Day now, was a day of liberation. It was actually a day of liberation from a terrible regime, which we hold responsibility for, you know, we were involved with, but still we were able to get a second chance and become a democratic nation. So that was the first time when people mentioned that sort of sense of liberation. And this seems to have now been transmitted into the new generation of things. Well, it is a complete liberation, and we are all liberated and so happy that ultimately the Nazis were defeated. And it's almost like it hadn't got anything to do with us. And that's, I think, where it gets tricky for me, because my grandfathers, my grandmother, they were all involved. They were alive during the war, and they had terrible stories to tell what happened to them. So for me personally, it's much more painful to think about the war as just a liberation. There's also a huge amount of pain associated with that. So I think this is to cut a long story very short.
I think it's very interesting as how a nation can live with some guilt. I mean, if you want to see that, that's emerging also, you know, within British history. For example, if you look back at the turn of the century, all the school textbooks and all things were in praise of the British Empire, what the British Empire was civilizing the world and how superior we were. And yet we recognize now as a society which has many different ethnic groups who came from that empire, how repressive it was in all sorts of ways. And it's quite difficult for nations to deal with guilt. And clearly the German guilt was huge because it was such an extreme totalitarian regime, which inflicted such terrible behavior on, well, you have to think of the Holocaust, but also those conquered nations. So that's very difficult, and for the next generation to have to bear that guilt, when really what you're looking for is to try and heal those wounds. And you could see VE Day in some ways, celebrating 75 years of victory in Europe, as also as a way of reopening those wounds, which I hope won't happen. And I know over the last few years, there's been hands of friendship extended between the veterans of the war who were fighting each other, killing each other, now actually trying to come together, because in the end, it's the importance about how you treat other members of the human race rather than your view on a nation. I mean, I don't think the modern generation have any real animosity towards Germany other than you keep beating us at football.
Well, it's fascinating. You know, I have watched, you know, being in this country now for 27 years, I've watched the different sort of, even this country going through different phases, you know, always the, you know, the D-Day celebrations, and then, you know, the pride that comes along with that, you know, sort of unreserved celebration of war and of victory. You know, it is always sort of, it's always sort of stuck with me and saying, oh God, how can we celebrate war full stop? How can we actually be really jubilant about war? And it took, because we had been so trained in Germany to really seeing war as a disaster. I mean, talk about that a bit more, you know, for Germany, you know, war was an immense disaster. And so there was just nothing funny and nothing glorious about war. And to some degree, it was also because we lost it. You know? I think if we'd won it, I think we would have probably had much more of a relaxed relationship, or perhaps also victorious, or a positive feeling associated. But for us, it was just 100% you lose, I lose, everybody loses, a lose-lose-lose experiment. And it's always sat very, very uncomfortably with me to really see that sort of unreserved pride, you know, in war, and when, because it was, you know, this country is it was a war-winning nation in 2 occasions, not just one. You know, I learned a completely different ethos towards the whole concept of war. I think Germany fundamentally is a pacifist nation. We really just hate war, full stop.
That's very interesting, because it is in terms of culture. Now, I'm not much older than you, so I'm not quite another generation, but almost. And my childhood, all the comics that we got as children were about how we beat the Germans. And they were stereotypical Germans, usually shouting Himmel or whatever it was, Raus, Raus. And I grew up with that. But at the same time, I had the family history. Now, and I'm sure it's the case in your family. My family, my father involved in the war, my uncles, didn't talk about it much. And I didn't really discover until much later what was going on. But I do remember as a child, my father had this wonderful camouflage jacket, which he used for gardening. And it was a wonderful thick jacket with camouflage, green camouflage on one side, and then you could turn it round and it was completely white on the other side. And of course, he had been given it. It was a wonderful German jacket that somehow he'd got hold of. But to personalize it, now I'll tell this story because it brings it home to me. I remember as a child, he always had a bad back, and he used to wear one of these terrible corset things. And as a child, you sort of grow up with this and think about it. And then much later in life, I managed to get him to talk about it. And I have to say, he probably had 3 or 4 whiskies. And he explained to me how he had been involved in the Arnhem campaign. The Arnhem campaign. Now, the Arnhem campaign was a disaster for the Allies. It was called Operation Market Garden. And the idea was that they were going to seize bridges going through Holland to shorten the war. And the final target over the Lower Rhine was the bridge at Arnhem. The Allied intelligence was very poor, and what they didn't realize was that there was a German panzer division actually based in Arnhem. And they dropped 10,000 paratroopers into Arnhem to have to deal with this. And they did seize the bridge, and there is a sort of slightly jingoistic film called A Bridge Too Far, which you may know about, but it roughly covers what the thing is. Now, my father wasn't in the paratroopers, he was in the Land Army, in the Coldstream Guards, and he was in a troop transporter. He was a captain at the time, and he was sat in the front with the driver, and they were going up one of these Dutch roads, going up to Arnhem. As you can imagine, they're very flat, and the German army had got some very good anti-tank guns and emplacements, so it was very dangerous. And they saw firing going up ahead, and my father said to the driver, look, let's pull in, because we're just a troop. There's a tank right behind us. We'll follow the tank. So they pulled in, and my father said to the driver, look, I'm just going to check exactly where we are. And at the back of the troop carrier, where the troops were, there was a little map table. So he goes to the back and he sits at the map table. The driver rolls the troop carrier slightly forward, straight over a landmine. Boom! They're all blown up. My father goes straight up through the canvas roof, and he could have been a foot one way, the other way, or a meter the wrong way, and he would have had his head split in half with the iron hoop. But he went straight through, and what a lucky guy! He landed in a tree. And 2 days later, they found him. So, as a child, this is one fantastic story. Well, actually, I was a teenager when I got this out of him. Really interesting story about something personalized with the war. And then I remember, and we were living in Birmingham at the time, and we were sat round the family table, and I was the youngest of 3 children. I can't remember how old I was, perhaps only 5 or 6 at the time. But I remember this so clearly. He came in and he was laughing. And my mother said to him, what are you laughing about? He said, I've just received a telegram from the War Office saying that I've never handed in my service revolver. And where is it? And he said, I had great pleasure in writing back to them and saying, I think it's in this Dutch field somewhere. You can always go and look for it if you need it. So that sort of personal tied me to the war. So the war was very important in my childhood. And we had things on television, and it was pretty jingoistic. It was pretty, as you say, it was, in that sense, we could be proud because we won the war, and also at the same time because we were the politically correct ones. Nazi Germany was the horror. Now, from your point of view, I can see that it would be a much more different approach. You can't go having comic books full of soldiers having British stereotypes, because the problem was they won. As a child, it's all about very simplistic stuff, winning or losing. But that's my little personal story.
Well, this is so fascinating, and there's so many things I could pick up on, including the bridge too far, which was called the Brücke von Arnhem, which is the bridge of Arnhem in the German. And I watched this. It was one of the first films I watched in the cinema by myself. I was probably about 12, 13. The time when you actually go to the cinema, become an adult. And I remember vividly sort of seeing the Germans as the enemy. And as the evil guys in the film that sort of somehow win this thing, and you think, oh my God, this is terrible.
But actually, to interrupt, to be fair, I thought the film didn't do the terrible usual stereotype of Germans.
No. But obviously, it was from an American sort of British perspective, and so you were really with your actors, yes. And you were really suffering with them, yes. And you thought, fuck, the other guys on the other side. These are probably actually my grandfathers. So this is how we sort of developed as youths, really sort of sympathizing with these films, obviously with the British and the Americans, because they were often depicted as the ones that overcame the bad guys, which was actually my team. The bad guys was actually my heritage. So with time, I obviously developed a bit of a sort of a more subtle view of how does this all work? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? My family are the good guys, but they were the bad guys in the war, and how do we bring it together? And so the stories emerged, and I was one generation, 20 years behind the end of the war. So 2 generations, my great aunt and my grandfathers, grandmothers, they were obviously full of stories that came out in little moments. And I just like to tell the story of my grandmother, who I was very fond of, and she was a very good narrator of history. She was a medical student. She actually got into medical school. As a woman during the war, she actually went to medical school at a quite late age. She was already in her mid-30s. So she was sort of my role model to become a doctor in a way. She always took pride that she took studies in medical school, never finished, because something happened in the meantime that she never finished her medical studies, which was she got married and she got kids. And that was during the war. And she lived in a place called Darmstadt. Darmstadt is a small town next to Frankfurt, and Darmstadt it was a sort of took a bit of pride in having a sort of an archduke who was basically vaguely related to the British sort of crown, and so Darmstadt was always wondering why all other cities around Darmstadt were bombed during the war, but not Darmstadt. They always say, "Oh, it's probably because we're related to the." So this was the myth. Everybody was on. Every other town's now been bombed. We haven't been bombed. Why not? Oh, well, because of that. So these are the kind of little myths that went on before our September the 11th, my September the 11th, which was the September the 11th of 1944, and that was when Darmstadt's turn was to be bombed. And I had a quite sort of vivid description from another relative of mine of how that went, because I think it was a night bombing. And it's also very well described by Bomber Command, Max Hastings, a book about bombing, which is very painful to read for me. And basically, they basically bombed Darmstadt, and Darmstadt was largely destroyed, including the wealth and the heritage of my grandmother. She was sitting in a bunker very near the house. You know, the alarm bells went off. You know, the sirens went off. She went and took what she called, I don't know what the translation would ever be, the box that the Jewish people had when they were going to the Mount Sinai. There was a box they were carrying, and she had that name for that box where she kept all the essentials, all the paperwork, all her jewels, some money. She took that to the bunker, and including some, some letters and all the rest of it. And she stayed in the bunker, and the city was bombed. And when she came out of the bunker, her wealth, in form of a big house with some tenants in it and all the rest of it, gone. It was burned to the ground, that was the end of her being a sort of rather wealthy and rather established woman. So she basically had a little country shed. It wasn't even a proper house. It was more like a habitable shed, about 50, perhaps 80 kilometers out of Darmstadt. That's where she went to live for a few years. Now, the good news about this is that something really, really useful came out of this. That's why I'm telling this story. It's quite existential in a way. Because she had fallen in love, and she had got married to that beautiful, handsome, sort of dashing younger soldier. Actually, he was 5 years younger than she was, who she'd met. She was a medical student, so she was looking after injured soldiers the year before, and she met this dashing, handsome man, who turned out to be her husband to be, and she got married to him, really in love. They were reading poetry to each other, and and because she was bombed, the German sort of command had a little compassionate edge to it, and we call it, you were bombed out, ausgebombt. Ausgebombt is the German expression. You were sort of bombed out of your house, which basically reflects what Harris was trying to do. He was trying to bomb people out of their house. So she was ausgebombt. And when you're ausgebombt, you can basically get your relatives to come and support you. So my grandfather, who's on the Russian front, he got some leave. So he got some leave, and then guess what happened? He came back. He found his, my grandmother in her little shed somewhere near Darmstadt. Love was still in the air. So he then sort of stayed, and then we had to go back to the Russian front. He came back. His story was, and this is a different story, he was basically then meeting the Americans and the Russians meeting in Torgau and the Elbe, and sort of shaking hands there, and he was there. And they divided the prisoners, the German prisoners, up, counting 1, 2, 1, 2. And he got the odds, and he went to British, being a British prisoner of war, while everybody else with the odds went to the Russians. Now, the ones who went to Russians didn't come back, and he was back in May, late May, early June 1945. And then my mother was born.
Wow, and that's amazing. I mean, that is such a good story, because as you say, he could easily have had to go to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And we know that they were, well, essentially just used as slave labor, and so many died. So he was, yeah, the luck. We both had, I mean, we're here. We both had amazing bits of luck from obviously the different sides of the war. But that's a fascinating story. And of course, yes, I mean, what you're saying is a lot of contentious stuff about the bombing, and of course there were a lot of resistance to Bomber Command even getting a memorial here because of Harris's view on carpet bombing, which I think attitudes changed, but it was clearly at the time, and I guess this would be the same for the German army, would say exactly the same. It was desperate times. We were in,
absolutely.
And this is what happened to our ancestors in a way.
That's right.
They were involved in that.
And you know, I think my grandmother's, you know, she told the story very vividly. You know, she said it came out, and she, you know, the feeling that she described when she came out and said, "I'm alive." Her house was destroyed. She went through the rubble and she found the Iron Cross that her father had earned during the First World War, which is still in my possession somewhere. So it was burnt, but you know, still the iron was left. She saved that. She gave it to me at some stage. I didn't know what it meant. I really didn't. You know, obviously much later you would start establishing what on earth is this object. Yeah. But she said, I was just glad to be alive. I wasn't in a bad mood. I was happy to be alive. Because lots of people, 20,000 people died in Derbyshire that night. And so she was happy to be alive. And she never looked back in anger. And she said, this is an interesting story that I think connects me back to why I'm here and sort of the British. She had a very fond relationship with Britain. She spoke English fluently. In fact, she was actually engaged to a man who was half Jewish before the war. And he said, we need to go and get married in England. So she was planning to leave for England in the mid-30s. So she was a very fond relationship with England for some reason. And she said, I heard the story, it was reported then that a British bomber was basically taken down by the flak, as we call them. And they lynched one of the pilots that survived. And she said, I was really upset about that. That wasn't right. That was really awful. I was really upset about it. And I've been telling this story, sort of makes me well up because it obviously reflected on the you know, on the drama, on the human drama of, you know, you're in the middle of something that you have got no control over. You know, you haven't chosen to live in Germany at that time. Your wealth is being destroyed. My grandmother was, after that, a very, very modest, you know, she was a sort of rather wealthy woman before that, because she was getting rental income from that house that she had tenants in there, and that was all destroyed. So she lived on a very modest sort of amount of money. She was no longer a rich or a wealthy woman. So her life had changed for good. But at the same time, there was a certain amount of, so this is not personal. You know, these guys are not doing this because they want to hit me. You know, this is because we're sort of all part of something that's much larger than us. And so she was expressing that with a lot of sort of emphatically, that was really upsetting that they did that to that poor British guy. you know, and to the day I wish I would establish who that person was. So one of my projects would be to really find out who that family was.
There must be just endless stories of
Yeah.
those things happening, and of course war, and it's a cycle, isn't it? Once people start being killed and drumming up the enemy, and of course governments, in terms of having to, well, wanting to win wars, drum up that sort of hatred, so that the propaganda, I was reading about the propaganda of the First World War, which was even worse in terms of some of the propaganda and how dehumanizing you make the enemy. I suppose in the Second World War, just because of the regime, that the politics was so much easier than in the First World War. In the First World War, it was patriotism and jingoism, and what was that about was actually territory and power, and really, in some ways, quite banal issues. Whereas the Second World War was much more about an ideology and about how where the world was going.
Yeah.
But of course, I mean, historians always link the German defeat in the First World War, which seemed to the Germans so unfair in the way that they were punished after Versailles. It links that to the rise of Hitler and the way he was able to manipulate his power to bring the German people along with him, because they felt they had been cheated.
That was very vivid in my family. So I'm going back to that grandmother. She was born in 1907, the same year the house I'm sitting in was built. And so she was 7 years old when the First World War happened. And she has got vivid memory. She had vivid memory of people sort of queuing up to go to war. I mean, there was this really sort of, and I saw this also looking at British war films, there was this really masculine sort of enthusiasm. People were singing to go to war. She was describing people were singing in the street where they're so happy to go to war, because there was this sort of this almost like war being it's almost like going to the Olympic Games, We're giving them a good beating, We'll be back by Christmas and I'll send you cards from Paris. These are the this was the ethos. And she really embodied that herself. She said, oh God, we were so happy, And I remember the enthusiasm, the pride of being in the army, and that masculine sort of heroic sort of ethos. It was just, and she told me this story. She told me the story of a 7-year-old girl really absorbing that energy. And I thought, oh my God, if she had understood, or if they had understood, but this shows the atmosphere in Europe. I mean, they couldn't wait to shoot each other.
Yes. It's extraordinary, isn't it? But of course, I'm looking at the broader picture about human competition and how competitive we are. And we can't just think because we're rational beings, we can somehow just sort of sweep that under the carpet. Wars are based on a lot of animal instinct, and it's about winning, and it's about competing. That's why I argue that sport is so important. It's really important we compete in sport, because no one's going to get killed. We might lose some pride, we might feel annoyed, but actually you've got the competition, you've got that aggression coming out of your system and whatever it is, and you can take pride in winning without actually harming anyone. Whereas war is the political side of that, where you want to harm someone. That's a terrible human, and I don't think it's just cultural. I think it is actually part of the built into our genetic makeup to compete and to win. And you think, yes, the First World War, they were in all the countries queuing up to go to war. They believed in the patriotism. They believed that they should win. They believed that that was important. And when you think of the loss of life and how horrendous it was, you just think, how could they be so naive as to want to start that off over, what are they fighting over? Influence, power, territory? Crazy.
Well, the more I learn about the First World War, I agree with you. I mean, it's almost like, it felt like a bit of a sort of complete underestimation of the loss of life, but it felt almost like a bit of a male sort of game. It almost felt like, let's just have a good bashing out there, and the atmosphere that comes through the films and through we hear about it initially but also what sort of the likes of my grandmother described as a very emotional. It just stuns me, and it stuns stuns Germans in general, because we have, after the Second World War, developed such a strong ethos of war just being wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong with war, and so VE Day, for me, is always something where the celebration really doesn't arise. And this is sort of the contrast thing again. I think I think British people and probably American people just do not understand how utterly despicable we find the concept of war in Germany. I think there have been recent wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Africa, Libya, and every time it happens, the British say, "Come on, let's just send a drone in there, or send a few troops in there to support these people. Just go in, just sort it out, get out." And the Germans will always say, "We're not going. we're not going. We're not doing war." And the Americans, in the Iraq, in the second Gulf War, the post 9/11 war, so the weasels in Europe, they're too shy to go to war, and they just don't understand. They don't fundamentally understand how utterly aversive war is for Germans, and that brings us down to two elements. One is, obviously, we have got a long tradition of causing harm to our neighbours, being involved in war, and being sometimes successful, sometimes not, mostly not successful. Sometimes we were, particularly with the French. Successful, inverted commas, because, it was always just sort of some sort of nationalistic, sort of painful loss of lives. But also then the destruction of Germany, and the pain that came along with that, and also the loss of half, probably the third of Germany was basically eternally lost, and people don't realise that either. That is also another element of the Germans didn't only lose the war; they lost a third of their country. Yeah, where Germans had lived for hundreds of thousands of years, it was just gone. Yeah, so I think that's sort of another edge to the story.
I think that there are two things. As we're commemorating VE Day on the 8th, there's two things that come out of that. One is that it should be a commemoration not of the victory of the war, but of the celebration that it led to peace.
Yeah.
And from that, of course, the European Union was founded, and there hasn't been a war amongst the members of the European Union. Yeah. And that shows that you can actually, by working together, however flawed the European Union is, and clearly a lot of people in Britain think it was very flawed because they didn't want to stay in it, but nevertheless, in terms of the geopolitical situation, it has created a lasting peace within Europe. The other aspect is the really tricky one, and I can understand in Germany this would be difficult. Easier here because we won the war, so we can be victorious in a sense. But it's also, when do you need some defense, because the rest of the world doesn't think the same way. So how do you defend yourself against more aggressive nations who haven't suffered in the same way, or don't have the same culture or ideological perception? And so you have to have armies to resist. Now, clearly, Iraq was a really interesting situation where intervention was about regime change, get rid of Saddam Hussein and so on. But of course, there was no real long-term understanding of what this would do to a country like Iraq, which was a made-up country. And so, of course, it fell apart into its different sectarianisms and has become a disaster in terms of political planning. So then Syria comes along, and the West, led by America as the most powerful democratic country, finds itself stymied. It doesn't know what to do, because it doesn't want to interfere, because Iraq had interfered and that failed. And yet at the same time, up until we've had all these other newsworthy items like Brexit and coronavirus, up until that time, the television newsreels were full of what was happening in Syria and the disastrous things. And people were saying, as they always do, why aren't we doing something? Like we should be interfering. And yet Iraq is a really good example of when interference can go wrong, and you can actually create a situation which, it may not be worse, but it's certainly no better than it was originally under Saddam Hussein.
So I think you're raising so many points, and that's why, for me, VE Day is also a day of celebration. Yeah, and I think this is sort of how the German perception is slowly changing, and we're probably, as our forefathers that were in the war, sort of dying out naturally, as they are here as well. 75 minutes. By the way, my mother is probably the European person that has lived longest through times of peace. So she was born in June 1945. So, 8th of May, June, she was about a month late. Otherwise, she would have been the European that has been living through the longest period of peace. So she stands for that longest. She has lived a life without a war. 75 years of it. And I think that's a major achievement. And as you say, I think there's two points I'd like to make, is that Germany obviously have made a strong commitment never to have a war again, never to attack any other countries, and to see war as something that is just not on. It's just not there anymore. So the banning of war and the inception of the UN, probably much more before the EU, UN, and with its Charter of Human Rights, very much coming out of also the terrible human rights sort of perceptions during the Nazi time, through the Nazi time, establishing racism, establishing denigration of others, separation from others as a principle, had to be balanced out with the Charter of Human Rights. And the banning of wars. I think that's what people don't always appreciate. Wars are illegal. Wars are no longer allowed unless there's special permission from the UN to do war. Yeah, and so that ethos, I think, is such a huge achievement that came out of the Second World War and came out of VE Day, and I think that's very meaningful to me. Saying, God, we've nailed peace. And so when people look at Germany from here, really seeing it as a nation that is deeply, really fundamentally committed to being peaceful in a very, very sort of deep, sort of rooted way, because we've really felt the pain of war, probably even more than the British. The British obviously suffered during the war blitz, Canterbury, not Canterbury, what's the other?
Coventry, I think.
Coventry, I meant. Coventry, I'm not saying British didn't suffer. Blitz wasn't painful, but it was comparatively mild. It wasn't, but it was comparatively mild what happened to Germany and its destruction and its separation. And my grandfather, another story, lost his home country. He came from East Prussia, which is now actually in Poland. So the destruction through war has been so strong that there's a deep commitment in Germany to peace. There's a deep commitment to negotiation as the tool of resolving conflict. And that's what the EU is. When we think about the EU as a sort of product of the Second World War, product of VE Day, it is a negotiation tool, where we can talk about conflict. We don't like each other. How can we talk about it? We've got a problem with each other. You're richer than we are, or you owe us this, or you want this, we want that. How do we negotiate it in a way that we don't start killing each other again? And I think that's what people don't really understand in Britain. And I'm not blaming the British for it, because they obviously got a different tradition, different experience in the Second World War. It's victorious. It's great. We did a great job. For us in Germany, it has been a real destruction, a real sort of fundamental hate of war, which That's why VE Day for me is a great day to celebrate, because it banished war as a legal tool of politics. It implemented human rights in the Human Rights Charter, and that has made life on Earth much better.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because after the First World War, there was a view that there should never be another war. And of course, the League of Nations was formed. But there wasn't that sense of solidarity in Europe about what had happened. And certainly in Germany, there was a resentment in the way that it was treated at Versailles. And I think that we've moved on, I'm glad to say, in a way, in that sense that the Marshall Plan that was introduced after the Second World War was not about punishment, it was about rebuilding. And I think we've got to remember that. That element of wanting to punish Germany in the First World War was disastrous for Europe. And I think the EU, although it, as I mentioned earlier, it has all sorts of flaws, it makes it very difficult for people to take up arms against each other. There's so many mechanisms by which, as you say, you can shout at each other, you can get annoyed, you can do all sorts of things which are basically human, and they're only what we need to do as humans when we're upset and angry. But it's contained within a framework which makes it impossible then to start actually fighting each other. And I think that's been the greatest achievement in some ways of the EU. And without making any sort of political point, because I know the majority in this country wanted to leave the EU on the vote, on the referendum, but there's still that very important relationship that Britain must keep with Europe to remember. And I think VE Day is important. We should celebrate those that brought about the victory in the war, because obviously Nazi Germany was a horrible state that had to be removed. But we should also commemorate the individuals who lost their lives. We should commemorate the families and what you were saying about the devastation. And no, of course, Britain suffered devastation, but nothing to the extent that Germany suffered devastation. And it's trying to empathize without necessarily justifying. It's trying to empathize, to understand that is an important way forward. That's why this conversation is important, because I mean, I know you're a bit of an Anglophile, so you're prejudiced a bit, but that's an important conversation, because we cannot, we should not, we must not ever get sucked into some sort of rivalry or political contention that leads to us trying to kill each other again in the future.
And I think this is so important, and I think we're at a real sort of a point where the lines may be shed in very, very difficult ways, because I feel that we are at the verge of re-entering a zone that feels very much like pre-First World War, where national states just think, oh, we're this, we're Germans because we're good at sort of building cars, and we've dealt with COVID so much better than everybody else, and we're British, we've got the best health system in the world, we dealt with so much better than everybody else. And the French, obviously the French are always the best in the world anyway, because they've got the best food and they've got the best health service, so I think there's a real risk that we're losing that sort of sense of cooperation, including the Russians, by the way. I mean, I've had so many long conversations with my Russian friends I met here in London, and beautiful people, and Russia has suffered so much during the war. If we think about the destruction of Germany, fair enough, it's my home country, but my God, was Russia destroyed. My God, was Poland destroyed. And the beautiful people I've met from Poland, who don't necessarily tell their story, but I know they've suffered so much being pushed between Russia and Germany, and what they've been through in the war, complete rubble, out of Warsaw, and, oh my God. So what I'm trying to say is, my fundamental belief is that, if we seize VE Day, for me, I wish we could do it as a celebration of ending of wars, convert from a victorious nation, sort of having won a war, great, fantastic. But could we just celebrate the end of any war? So the end of war as a means to particularly deal with our problems that we have in Europe. I think that would be would be such a lovely coming together of all nations, because we cannot afford another one of these. It's just, it's the next war. We've lost 50 million in the last war. We're going to lose 5 billion in the next one. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Well, we've got such sophisticated weapons now. You're right, it would be so disastrous. But you've raised an interesting point, and we've seen this happening across the world, not just in Europe, the rise of nationalist populist movements, where it's so easy to blame somebody else for your nation's woes, your tribe's problems. And that has been very worrying, that there's a lot of that sense that, oh, it's someone else's fault that we're not economically better off, or the world is not better. And no, it's the old chant. I mean, they're taking our economy away from us, our work away from us. Migration has in a sense heated up that issue of populism and nationalism. We've seen it clearly in America with Donald Trump. We see it in France with Marine Le Pen. We see it in Poland. We see it in Hungary with Orbán. We see it in Turkey with Erdogan. And of course, the most powerful man in the world at the moment as an individual, President Putin, who is very jingoistic and militaristic. The seizure of Crimea, the support of eastern Ukraine against the Ukrainian government, and so on. So, and then you get even worse if you move into the Middle East with what's going on in Syria, with Iran, Saudi Arabia. There's so much to be worried about in that sense. So it's important Europe sets a good example and deals with its difficulties and its controversies in a peaceful manner.
Absolutely, and I hope this is probably you and I are probably going to be lone voices, I suspect, particularly under the current sort of crisis where everybody's just fighting for themselves, and everybody's looking at their own health system, and it pains me so much, because I think we've lost massive opportunities to work together in the COVID crisis, which is a form of war against the virus, isn't it? But really sort of thinking that there is no alternative to cooperation. I think if there was an alternative, I think people would do it. But, if we think there is an alternative to cooperation, it's just wrong. There is none. And it is a pity that, the leadership of that sense of cooperation needs to be in Europe. It needs to be Central Europe. It needs to be in Britain. It needs to be in France. It needs to be in Italy. It needs to be in Germany. It needs to be among the great cultural nations, the great cultural hearts, the Spanish, the Polish, the great cultural hearts of Europe, that we are ahead of the game with regards to what's happening in Russia. And we are ahead of the game, unfortunately, and with a bleeding heart. I'll, say this with what's happening in America. America, who we've looked towards for the last 73 years or 72 years as a leader of the Western world, as a leader of liberal thinking, as a leader of human rights, as a leader of peace. Even if you use force to implement peace, still peace. And now look at where they've got to. They will be looking back on themselves saying, how could we get to the shameful position that we're finding ourselves in as a nation? Yeah, so it rests with us. It rests with us. There's nobody else to really stand up for the values of peace, for the values of cooperation, for the values of human rights. It rests with Europe, and and I say this with a real sort of pride on, to some degree, of being European. And the migrant crisis was such an example of how Europe, even fighting each other, still standing together, somehow absorbing some of these terribly unfortunate people that come to Europe. And you remember in 2015, Germany opened its borders to about at least 1 million, refugees that settle in Germany. 1 million.
I think that's a very positive area. I mean, we are a competitive species, but one thing that makes us quite unique is the level at which we are able to cooperate.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important message. I've really enjoyed talking to you, Florian. It's been an interesting conversation, and I hope that we've shed some sunlight when we remember that VE Day is not just about triumphal flag waving. It's also about bringing peace to Europe and the chance for Europeans and all across the nations to cooperate and look forward to a peaceful future. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Tim, for having this conversation. And I'm so sad it ends already, but an hour is probably enough of us. Thank you.